Josef Mengele, known to history, was born on March 16, 1911 in Günzburg, a town in southern Germany. His father, Karl Mengele, an engineer, had recently become the owner of a foundry around Josef's birth. This foundry produced agricultural implements designed for sawing, cutting, and milling, among other applications. With 7 employees in the early 1910s, the Mengeles were considered one of the wealthier families in the Günzburg vicinity. Josef's mother, Walburga Hupfauer, later bore Joseph's 2 younger brothers, Karl Jr. and Alois. Joseph's formative years unfolded amidst the throes of total war. Germany's unification as a nation was relatively recent. As late as the 1860s, its territory was fragmented into over 20 smaller states. However, in 1871, these states coalesced under Prussian leadership, forming the German Empire. This drastically altered the European balance of power, setting the stage for decades of escalating tensions. Germany entered into an alliance with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, while Britain, France, and Russia formed a counter-alliance to check Germany's growing influence. Initially, these powers confined their conflicts to proxy wars in Africa and the Balkans. However, in the summer of 1914, a localized Balkan dispute triggered a widespread European war. This conflict soon expanded globally, drawing in nations like Japan. Thus began the First World War, lasting over 4 years. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire fought against Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, with the United States later joining the Allied forces. Germany's defeat resulted in the empire's dissolution and the establishment of a new German republic named after Weimar. Crucially, a series of punitive peace terms were imposed upon Germany under the Treaty of Versailles, creating lasting repercussions. The infant Mengele may have been somewhat aware of these events, as they significantly impacted the Mengele household. Karl enlisted in the German army shortly after the war's commencement, leaving Walburga to raise their children and sustain the family business throughout the war. By the early 1920s, it had become Germany's 3rd largest producer of threshing machinery. Extended family members were enlisted to assist in the company's expansion, leading to the Mengele name's prevalence in Günzburg to this day. Karl Mengele Strasse, a main thoroughfare in town, stands in stark contrast to the horrific crimes later perpetrated by Karl and Walburga Mengele's eldest son, juxtaposed with the wider Mengele family's civic prominence. More immediately, this affluence afforded Joseph extensive educational opportunities during the 1920s. Mengele proved a reasonably successful student during his teenage years, excelling in art and cultivating broad interests in music and physical activities, notably skiing, given the town's proximity to the German Alps' northern reaches. In April 1930, Josef Mengele completed his high school exams, achieving a respectable, albeit not exceptional grade. He initially considered dentistry, noting the absence of a local dentist and perceiving it as a promising profession. However, he later deemed it too specialized and opted for medicine, focusing on anthropology and genetics. Clearly ambitious, his correspondence from this period reveals an individual eager to impress his family by becoming its first medical scientist. Thus, in October 1930, he left home for Munich, Bavaria's capital. There he enrolled in both medicine and philosophy, indicating an interest in medicine's scientific rigor and broader intellectual inquiry. This blend of interests would later yield terrifying consequences. Mengele arrived in Bavaria as a nascent political party was gaining traction and ascending to power. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, founded a decade prior, had rapidly come under the sway of Austrian agitator Adolf Hitler. In November 1923, this group of disgruntled war veterans, primarily concerned with preventing the rise of leftist parties like the Communists and rectifying the punitive Treaty of Versailles terms, attempted a coup in Munich. However, it was swiftly suppressed. Subsequently, they shifted to constitutional politics to achieve their aims, initially faltering in elections until autumn 1929. Following a decade of rapid expansion, the Wall Street Stock Exchange suffered catastrophic losses, plunging the global economy into a downturn. As individuals across Germany faced job losses and financial ruin, parties like the Nazis and Communists experienced a surge in electoral support. As the Great Depression, triggered by the Wall Street crash, persisted into the early 1930s, Hitler and his associates gained increasing popularity. Their message resonated with xenophobia and resentment towards Germany's global standing. Mengele soon became entangled in the swirling political currents, although he would not formally join the Nazi Party for some time. In March 1931, he joined the Stahlhelms, a veterans organization named after the German army helmets of World War I. The Stahlhelms regularly held marches and military-style rallies. However, the Nazis also held early appeal for the young Josef. In his later autobiography, Mengele noted, "The students of the university, those who had already reached the voting age, had contributed to this Nazi success. I was not then old enough to vote. My political leanings then were, I think, for reasons of family tradition, national conservative. I had not joined any political organization, though indeed I was strongly attracted by the program and the whole organization of the National Socialists. But for the time being, I remained an unorganized private person. But in the long run, it was impossible to stand aside in these politically stirring times, should our fatherland not succumb to the Marxist Bolshevik attack. This simple political concept finally became the decisive factor in my life." This suggests Mengele's Nazi Party affiliation was only a matter of time. Mengele's early Munich years coincided with the Nazis' full ascent. By 1932, Hitler and his associates had become Germany's largest political party, securing 40% of the national vote in that year's Reichstag elections. This, however, remained insufficient for a majority government, and German politics remained unstable throughout the latter half of 1932. The central question was whether Germany would gravitate towards the Nazis or the Communists. By then, Germany's second-largest political force, the ascendance of either party threatened the Weimar Republic's survival. Then in late 1932 and early 1933, the political and business establishment struck a Faustian bargain with Hitler and the Nazis. They agreed to incorporate Hitler and several senior Nazi figures into the government, misguidedly believing they could control him and his party. This fatal miscalculation allowed the Nazis, once inside, to rapidly consolidate absolute power. A political emergency was fabricated to justify the Enabling Act's passage, effectively granting Hitler, as chancellor, dictatorial powers. Thus, within mere months during early 1933, the Nazis seized absolute control across Germany, establishing a one-party state that would endure for 12 years. By 1934, Mengele was increasingly absorbed by his studies, although contemporaries later noted that he was never considered a particularly distinguished student. Many, however, observed that he compensated for any intellectual shortcomings with ambition and diligence. His ambition drove Mengele to concurrently pursue a doctorate in practice medicine during the mid-1930s. His academic pursuits did yield rewards. In 1935, Mengele earned a PhD for his thesis, Racial Morphological Research on the Lower Jaw Section of 4 Racial Groups. In it, Mengele posited that an individual's race could be determined solely by examining their jaw. Notably, at this juncture, Mengele's findings were based on established scientific principles, devoid of overt racist or anti-Semitic sentiments. This is significant, suggesting Mengele had not yet undergone the radicalization that would later define him. Having completed his thesis and obtained his doctorate, Mengele briefly worked as a junior resident doctor, a mandatory service for obtaining a full medical license. During this time, while at a Leipzig hospital, he first encountered Irene Schönbein, whom he later married in 1939. Their only son, Rolf, was born in 1944. However, while his personal life flourished, Mengele found the demanding, long-hour work of a resident doctor unsuited to his aspirations. Eager to resume his research, he secured a research assistant position at the Third Reich Institute for Heredity, Biology, and Racial Purity at the University of Frankfurt in January 1937. Here he studied under Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a Hitler admirer and self-proclaimed expert on the ominously termed concept of race hygiene. It is during this period that Mengele's more reprehensible views and character corruption undeniably took root. Until this point, while interested in race and genetics, his thesis lacked explicit racism. In Frankfurt, he became immersed in Nazi racial ideology. In May 1937, he formally applied to join the Nazi Party, soon accepted as member 5,574. Throughout the late 1930s, Mengele collaborated closely with von Verschuer, often co-authoring reports for Nazi state courts convened to adjudicate German Jewish individuals accused of violating the Nuremberg laws. These oppressive laws enacted in the mid-1930s aimed to disenfranchise Germany's Jewish population. This work involved perverse medical evidence. Defendants were frequently brought before the court to ascertain whether they possessed Jewish blood and thus violated Nuremberg laws. In some cases, Mengele and von Verschuer conducted physical examinations, measuring noses and other features to determine Jewish ancestry. A distinct shift is evident in Mengele's trajectory. In Munich, his research employed legitimate scientific methodologies, producing work generally considered unproblematic even by contemporary standards. However, in Frankfurt during the late 1930s, he descended into unscientific racial theories rooted in Nazi ideology. His time in Frankfurt clearly instigated a significant character transformation. Regardless of his work's nuances, Mengele's Frankfurt position facilitated rapid career advancement. Von Verschuer promoted Mengele to assistant physician after he obtained his full medical degree from Frankfurt in 1938. From this period onward, Mengele began articulating the concept of improving individuals and races through selective breeding, a clear indication of his complete immersion in Nazi racial ideology. Politically, he became increasingly entrenched in the regime. Months after joining the Nazi Party, he applied for membership in the Schutzstaffel SS, a Nazi paramilitary wing under Heinrich Himmler's command. The SS would soon oversee a network of concentration camps proliferating across Central and Eastern Europe. He would later join the Waffen-SS, an elite branch of the SS. His professional and political spheres were increasingly intertwined as he affiliated with the Third Reich Institute and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. Both institutions were at the forefront of eugenics research in Germany, effectively serving as mouthpieces for Nazi pseudoscientific racial ideology. As Mengele advanced his studies throughout the 1930s, the Nazis propelled Europe toward war. Overturning the Treaty of Versailles and reasserting Germany's European dominance had always been Hitler and his associates' stated goals. While overt efforts towards this end were absent in the initial years after the Nazis' 1933 power seizure, aggression escalated rapidly from 1936 onward. In spring 1936, the German army re-entered the Rhineland, remilitarizing a region expressly prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles. Austria was then effectively annexed into a Greater Germany in 1938. Further annexations swiftly followed, the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in autumn 1938, and in early 1939, the conquest of Central Europe was largely completed with Hungary and the remainder of Czechoslovakia becoming puppet states. At this point, Britain and France signaled that their policy of appeasing German aggression would cease, particularly if Hitler attempted to seize Poland. Consequently, when Germany invaded its eastern neighbor on September 1, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, marking the Second World War's commencement. On the cusp of the monumental conflict engulfing Europe, Mengele's career encountered its first and only significant obstacle under the Nazi regime. In summer 1939, he planned to marry Irene after several years of courtship. However, controversy arose before the wedding, as some questioned Irene's potential Jewish ancestry. Mengele enlisted the aid of well-connected colleagues and friends who assured the panel judging such matters that Irene possessed very Nordic ways. Yet extensive genealogical investigations, even reaching into U.S. records, could not definitively resolve the issue. Consequently, Josef could not conclusively prove that he was not marrying a woman with some Jewish heritage. Nevertheless, he managed to dismiss the question without fully answering it. A grim irony underlies this. The man who would soon determine individuals' fates based on racial purity was himself denied a Nazi regime certificate confirming his future children's pure Aryan lineage. Mengele welcomed the war's outbreak. His son Rolf later recounted his father viewing the war as a necessary struggle to restore German national prominence after years of post-World War I suppression. Mengele promptly enlisted. However, a recurrence of his kidney ailment in late 1939 delayed his active service until summer 1940. By then, German panzer divisions were swiftly conquering Western Europe. Mengele was initially stationed at a Kassel military base in central Germany. His posting there lasted only weeks before he was reassigned to a combat role as a Waffen-SS member, receiving the officer rank of Untersturmführer, sub-lieutenant. The subsequent months were spent in occupied Poland, attached to the Race and Resettlement Office's genealogical section. His task was to assess the racial purity and suitability of individuals selected for settlement as German colonists in Eastern Europe. The objective was to displace non-Germans from the newly established Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe. While Mengele served in Poland, the Nazi state continued its successful war efforts. The initial invasion of Poland in September 1939 resulted in its swift occupation. A phony war ensued through the winter and early spring of 1939 to 1940 as Britain and France belatedly rearmed in anticipation of a German offensive against France. When Hitler finally launched his Western offensive in spring 1940, Denmark and Norway were quickly occupied. By summer 1941, this possibility loomed, and other parts of Europe, including the Balkans, had fallen to the Axis powers. Thus, by mid-1941, the war situation appeared dire for Winston Churchill's government in London. As the war's tide turned in their favor, Nazi policy grew even more sinister. Confident of imminent European domination and freedom from international constraints, Hitler and Nazi leaders began contemplating more radical anti-Semitic policies. In 1940 and early 1941, they considered forcibly relocating millions of European Jews to Madagascar, where they would live in a vast open-air prison. However, with the North African campaign stalling and the Suez Canal seizure becoming less likely, a far more drastic concept emerged: the final solution. This plan involved forcibly rounding up European Jews and deporting them to dozens of concentration camps across Central and Eastern Europe. A small number of able-bodied individuals would be used as slave labor in factories producing German war materials, but the majority would be exterminated using gas within hours of arrival. This policy was ratified at the Wannsee Conference near Berlin in January 1942, and mass murder soon commenced at camps like Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. Mengele would soon be stationed at Auschwitz. Mengele saw combat in 1941. After a prolonged period in Poland, he was reassigned to the Eastern Front in mid-1941. Emboldened by 1940 successes, Hitler ordered his generals to plan the Soviet Union invasion. Operation Barbarossa, history's largest land invasion. Launched that summer, hundreds of thousands of German troops surged into the Soviet Union. The invasion initially achieved remarkable success as Soviet forces retreated and the Wehrmacht advanced towards Moscow and Leningrad. However, Joseph Stalin and his generals gradually mobilized their forces effectively. Then the Russian winter arrived. The German army, unprepared for the extreme cold, lacked adequate winter gear. Consequently, during the winter of 1941, the war's momentum began to shift as the German advance stalled near Moscow. Mengele served on this front in Ukraine in 1941, earning the Iron Cross Second Class for his actions. Mengele continued Eastern Front service even as the war turned against Germany. In January 1942, he was assigned to the Waffen-SS's Viking Division Medical Corps. This elite unit would ultimately penetrate deeper into Russian territory than any other German armed forces division. However, Josef was kept away from the front lines. As a medic attached to the division, he was deemed highly valuable and stationed near defensive lines, performing support operations rather than leading in combat. In July, the Viking unit engaged in fierce fighting near Rostov and Bataisk, a brutal 5-day battle of attrition. During this engagement, he received the Iron Cross First Class, a higher honor, for rescuing 2 wounded soldiers from a burning tank under enemy fire. After pulling them to safety, Mengele administered first aid. He also received the Black Badge for the wounded and the Medal for the care of the German people. Thus, Mengele returned to Poland towards late 1942, a highly decorated Eastern Front veteran. Mengele's return to Poland was likely not coincidental or merely a reward for battlefield service. It is more probable that his recall from the Eastern Front was due to his former mentor, Professor von Verschuur, appointed director of this institute, was tasked with overseeing Reich research into racial purity and eugenics. With the final solution decision and concentration camp system expansion, a limitless supply of research subjects became available at these camps. Researchers faced no consequences for their methods in this so-called research. Von Verschuur, planning his foray into concentration camps in summer 1942, mentioned taking former colleagues and students. Mengele was undoubtedly among them, and it appears von Verschuur secured Josef's Eastern Front recall in mid-1942 for this specific purpose. Consequently, by January 1943, after a brief Poland interlude, Mengele was back at the Berlin Institute, but he would soon be sent to the place synonymous with his name, Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. As these events unfolded, it became increasingly clear to any German realistically assessing the strategic situation that the war effort was doomed. Following the German defeat at Stalingrad, Russian forces gradually pushed German armies back. Moreover, in spring 1943, Britain, now joined by the US, defeated Axis forces in North Africa. In summer 1943, a southern European front opened against the Axis powers with the Western Allies' Operation Husky Invasion of Sicily, a prelude to invading mainland Italy. Meanwhile, Russians pressed the Germans back into Ukraine and Poland. In summer 1944, a Western front also opened with the D-Day landings in Normandy. Nazi Germany's defeat by the Allies was now inevitable. However, the speed of German retreat in which Allied power would reach Berlin first remained uncertain. Prosecution of high-ranking regime members might hinge on this. In May 1943, Mengele, now promoted to Hauptsturmführer, captain, received his Auschwitz posting. Auschwitz began modestly after Poland's conquest, but expanded into a vast complex under Commandant Rudolf Höss by 1943. It comprised 3 camps. Auschwitz I, the original camp, housed administration, guards, and early detention facilities. Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, served as an extermination camp. Here, Jews and others deemed undesirable by the Nazis, including Roma and Soviet POWs, were mass murdered in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms using Zyklon B gas. Bodies were then incinerated in on-site crematoria. This death factory claimed over 1 million lives, mostly Jewish, between 1942 and 1945. Auschwitz III, or Auschwitz-Monowitz, was a slave labor camp primarily for producing synthetic rubber for IG Farben. Mengele arrived at this vast complex in early summer 1943. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, Eduard Wirtz, the entire camp's chief medical officer, appointed Mengele chief physician of the Romani family camp. His wider camp role was varied and brutal. Auschwitz doctors were central to the selection, a process applied to new arrivals. As trains carrying thousands of Jews, Soviet POWs, Roma, and other victims arrived, they underwent physical examinations on the platform ramp. He would subsequently join the Waffen-SS, an elite subgroup within the SS, while his professional endeavors and political affiliations became increasingly intertwined. He joined both the Third Reich Institute and the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, institutions spearheading eugenics research in Germany and effectively serving as mouthpieces for Nazi pseudoscientific racial ideology. As Mengele pursued his studies throughout the 1930s, the Nazis steered Europe towards war. Overturning the Treaty of Versailles and reasserting Germany's position as a dominant European power had consistently been Hitler and his associates' stated objectives. While overt efforts towards this goal were not apparent in the initial years after the Nazis seized power in 1933, aggression escalated rapidly from 1936 onwards. In spring of that year, the German army reoccupied the Rhineland, remilitarizing a region expressly forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. Austria was then effectively annexed into a Greater Germany in 1938, followed by further annexations. The Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia in autumn 1938, and in early 1939, the conquest of Central Europe was largely completed with Hungary and the rest of Czechoslovakia transformed into puppet regimes. At this juncture, Britain and France signaled an end to their appeasement policy towards German aggression, particularly concerning Poland. Consequently, when Germany invaded its eastern neighbor on September 1, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, marking the onset of World War II. On the eve of the titanic struggle soon to engulf Europe, Mengele's career encountered its first and only significant obstacle under Nazi rule. In summer 1939, he planned to marry Irene after years of courtship. However, controversy arose concerning Irene's potential Jewish ancestry. Mengele sought assistance from influential colleagues and friends who assured the panel overseeing such matters that Irene exhibited very Nordic ways. Yet genealogical investigations, even extending to U.S. records, could not fully resolve the matter. Consequently, while Josef couldn't definitively disprove his bride-to-be's partial Jewish heritage, he managed to dismiss the question without providing a conclusive answer. A dark irony pervades this situation. The man soon to determine fates based on racial purity was himself denied a Nazi regime certificate, affirming his own children's pure Aryan lineage. Mengele welcomed the war's outbreak. His son Rolf later recounted his father viewing the war as a necessary struggle for German national resurgence after years of post-World War I oppression. Mengele promptly enlisted. However, a recurrence of his kidney ailment in late 1939 prevented his active service until summer 1940. By then, German panzer divisions were swiftly conquering Western Europe. Mengele was initially stationed at a military base in Kassel, central Germany. His time there was brief, as he was soon reassigned to a combat position as a Waffen-SS member, with the officer rank of Untersturmführer, sub-lieutenant. The subsequent months were spent in occupied Poland, attached to the Race and Resettlement Office's genealogical section. His role involved assessing the racial purity and suitability of individuals chosen for settlement as German colonists in Eastern Europe. The objective was to displace non-Germans from the newly established Lebensraum, or living space, in Eastern Europe. While Mengele served in Poland, the Nazi state enjoyed continued wartime success. The initial invasion of Poland in September 1939 resulted in its rapid subjugation. Then in early summer, a lightning attack on France led to the swift conquest of northern France and the Low Countries within weeks. By summer's end 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Further setbacks ensued as Benito Mussolini's Italy joined Hitler, initiating a North African campaign to seize Egypt and the Suez Canal from British control. By summer 1941, this possibility loomed, and other parts of Europe, including the Balkans, had fallen to the Axis powers. Thus, by mid-1941, the war situation looked increasingly bleak for Winston Churchill's government. As the war's tide turned in their favor, Nazi policy adopted an even darker character. Confident of imminent European dominion and liberation from international constraints, Hitler and Nazi leaders began contemplating a more radical approach to their anti-Semitic policies. In 1940 and early 1941, they considered forcibly relocating millions of European Jews to Madagascar, where they would reside in a vast open-air prison. However, as the North African campaign stalled and the Suez Canal seizure became less feasible, a far more drastic concept emerged: the final solution. This involved the systematic roundup of European Jews and their deportation to a network of concentration camps established across Central and Eastern Europe since the war's inception. A small fraction of able-bodied individuals would be used as slave labor in war material factories, but the majority would be exterminated by gassing within hours of arrival. This plan was formalized at the Wannsee Conference near Berlin in January 1942, and mass murder soon commenced at camps such as Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. Mengele would soon be posted to Auschwitz. Mengele experienced military combat in 1941. Following an extended period in Poland, he was reassigned to the Eastern Front in mid-1941. Emboldened by 1940's successes, Hitler ordered his generals to plan the Soviet Union invasion. Operation Barbarossa, history's largest land invasion, launched that summer. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. The invasion initially achieved remarkable success as Soviet forces retreated and the Wehrmacht advanced towards Moscow and Leningrad. However, Joseph Stalin and his generals gradually mobilized their troops effectively. Then the Russian winter descended. The German army, unprepared for the extreme cold, lacked adequate winter equipment. Consequently, the war's tide began to shift during the winter of 1941 as the German advance stalled near Moscow. Mengele served on this front in Ukraine in 1941, receiving the Iron Cross Second Class for his actions. Mengele continued Eastern Front service as the war turned against Germany. In January 1942, he was assigned to the Waffen-SS's Viking Division Medical Corps. This elite unit would ultimately penetrate deeper into Russian territory than any other German armed forces division. However, Josef remained stationed away from the front lines. As a medic attached to the division, he was considered highly valuable and was positioned near defensive lines, involved in support operations rather than frontline combat. In July, the Viking unit was deployed in fierce fighting near Rostow and Bataisk, a brutal 5-day battle of attrition. During this engagement, he received the Iron Cross First Class, a higher distinction, for rescuing 2 wounded soldiers from a burning tank under enemy fire. After pulling them to safety, Mengele provided first aid. He also received the Black Badge for the wounded and the Medal for the care of the German people. This institute was tasked with overseeing Reich research into racial purity and eugenics. With the final solution implementation and concentration camp system expansion, a virtually unlimited supply of human subjects became available for research at these camps, with researchers facing no repercussions for their methods in their so-called research. As early as summer 1942, von Verschuer, planning his visits to concentration camps, indicated he intended to bring former colleagues and students. Mengele was undoubtedly among them, and it appears von Verschuur secured Josef's recall from the Eastern Front in mid-1942 precisely for this purpose. Consequently, by January 1943, after a brief interlude in Poland, Mengele was back at the Berlin Institute, but he would soon be dispatched to the place synonymous with his name, Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. As these events transpired, any German realistically assessing the strategic situation recognized the war effort's futility. Following the German defeat at the Stalingrad, Russian forces gradually began pushing back German armies. Moreover, in spring 1943, Britain, joined by the US, defeated Axis forces in North Africa. In summer 1943, a southern European front opened against the Axis powers with the Western Allies' Operation Husky invasion of Sicily, preceding an invasion of mainland Italy. Meanwhile, Russian forces continued to push Germans back into Ukraine and Poland. In summer 1944, a Western front opened with the D-Day landings in Normandy. Nazi Germany's defeat by the Allies was now inevitable. However, the pace of German retreat and which Allied power would reach Berlin first remained uncertain. The prosecution of high-ranking regime members might depend on this. In May 1943, Mengele, now promoted to Hauptsturmführer, captain, received his Auschwitz posting. Auschwitz originated modestly after Poland's conquest, but expanded into a vast complex under Commandant Rudolf Höss by 1943. It encompassed 3 camps. Auschwitz, first, the original camp, housed administration, guards, and initial detention facilities. Auschwitz II, or Auschwitz-Birkenau, served as an extermination camp. Here, Jews and other Nazi-designated undesirables, including Roma and Soviet prisoners of war, were mass murdered in gas chambers disguised as shower rooms using Zyklon B gas. Bodies were then incinerated in on-site crematoria. This death factory claimed over 1 million lives, mostly Jewish, between 1942 and 1945. Auschwitz III, or Auschwitz-Monowitz, was a slave labor camp, primarily producing synthetic rubber for IG Farben. Mengele arrived at this vast complex in early summer 1943. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, Eduard Wirtz, the camp's chief medical officer, appointed Mengele chief physician of the Romani family camp. His broader camp role was multifaceted and brutal. Auschwitz doctors were central to the selection, applied to new arrivals. As trains carrying thousands of Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, Roma, and other victims arrived, they underwent physical examinations on the platform ramp. Little did the bewildered newcomers realize, but the doctors appraising them were issuing death sentences to the majority. They selected a small number deemed physically fit for labor camps, a few others for experimental research or other purposes. But the vast remainder were directed to gas chambers to die within hours. Mengele's detachment from emotional response to this process was strikingly evident. Some Auschwitz doctors genuinely disliked selection duty, a process condemning children and the elderly to death. In contrast, Mengele would sometimes appear for selection duty on his days off. Mengele soon engaged in other activities, highlighting a complete absence of emotional response to others' suffering. This began almost immediately at the Romani family camp to which he was initially assigned. Weeks after his Auschwitz arrival, a Noma outbreak occurred in the Romani camp. Noma is an aggressive gangrenous disease causing tissue death due to infection and subsequent blood supply deprivation. It particularly affects the mouth and lips. A typical doctor's primary concern would be patient treatment. However, Mengele's focus was conducting experiments on this poorly understood disease. Patients showing symptoms were isolated for study. Appallingly, several children with Noma were killed, their heads and organs removed and sent to the SS Medical Institute in Graz, Austria, for later analysis. This macabre research continued for months until the decision to liquidate the entire Romani camp on the night of August 2, 1944. Other atrocities occurred. Diseases of all types were rampant in the camps due to poor sanitation and the fact that new arrivals often carried diseases from the overcrowded trains. Typhus and scarlet fever outbreaks were frequent. Mengele's approach to these outbreaks was brutally utilitarian. In one typhus epidemic, he simply sent the entire population of an affected barracks, some 600 Jewish women, to the gas chamber. This barracks was then sterilized before housing hundreds of new, deloused, and newly clothed occupants. He was particularly ruthless towards Auschwitz's Romani population. However, his most brutal act was likely ordering the liquidation of thousands of Jewish people in late 1944 when camp ration supplies, A mere 700 calories daily for prisoners became unsustainable. While Mengele's actions in disease control and mass exterminations at Auschwitz were brutal, he is most infamous for his camp experiments. Mengele treated Auschwitz as a vast laboratory for his heredity and genetics research, begun in the mid-1930s. He regarded Auschwitz inmates as research material, as a chemist might view lab chemicals. Expendable. He was particularly interested in individuals with dwarfism and heterochromia iritum, the condition of having different colored eyes. His methods were often savage. One experiment involved injecting chemicals into heterochromia iritum patients' eyes to alter iris color. Often, after studying subjects to his perceived maximum, he had them killed or administered lethal injections himself for internal organ study and skeletal preservation for later research. Perhaps the most horrific experiments involved Mengele removing organs without anesthesia. One man having a kidney removed this way was promptly returned to work without pain relief. Mengele is especially notorious for his Auschwitz twin research, becoming obsessed with twins for heredity and characteristic studies. During selections on the train platform ramp, Mengele sought out twins for his research. These were typically twin children arriving together, though evidence exists of Mengele examining elderly twins nearing 70. The exact number of twin sets examined at Auschwitz remains unclear, but during summer 1944 alone, when 400,000 Hungarian Jews were mass murdered at Auschwitz, Mengele reportedly identified and examined at least 175 twin sets. Paradoxically, being a twin initially benefited survival at Auschwitz. Many selected by Mengele would otherwise have been sent directly to gas chambers. Mengele's twin subjects were also better fed than most inmates, heads unshaven, and often allowed to keep personal clothing instead of standard Auschwitz uniforms. Mengele's research involved extensive measurements and seemingly mundane twin examinations. Witnesses later testified to Mengele's meticulousness. Precise skull and facial feature measurements were taken. One twin Auschwitz survivor recalled Mengele measuring his and his brother's eyes for approximately 2 hours. Such examinations occurred 2 or 3 times weekly for months, accompanied by photographs. All this seems intended to record minute physical variations between identical and fraternal twins. However, a far more sinister aspect underlay this. Mengele often inflicted pain on one twin to observe the effects on the other. Chemicals were used and subjects were injected with random substances. Most brutally, Mengele's twin research extended to studying internal organs, routinely murdering twins via chloroform injections, and then dissecting them. Once, suspecting Romani twins of tuberculosis, he simply killed and autopsied them to confirm his suspicion. Mengele's suspicion proved unfounded. The children did not have TB. Most striking was Mengele's psychological detachment from killing. The result was chilling. Here was a man humming Italian operas while dissecting people he had murdered moments before, solely to study their organs. Unsurprisingly, Mengele became known at Auschwitz as the Angel of Death, partly due to his ubiquitous presence at selections and widespread knowledge of his experiments. Fortunately, the experiments were nearing their end. As the Russian advance into Poland continued through 1944, the SS began dismantling concentration camps and destroying evidence. By early winter, plans to abandon Auschwitz were underway. It was eventually liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. Mengele was relatively late to evacuate. On January 17th, he transferred to Gross-Rosen concentration camp in Lower Silesia, taking extensive research samples and notes, but leaving the bulk behind. His time at Gross-Rosen was brief. By mid-February, he had to evacuate again, narrowly evading advancing Soviet armies. This marked the beginning of a sustained effort to elude capture. For the next 3 months, Mengele moved westward, attempting to conceal his identity. By early May, he reached the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, where he learned of Hitler's April 30, 1945, Berlin suicide and the Third Reich's subsequent collapse. On May 8th, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's final surrender in Berlin, ending World War II in Europe. Mengele became a wanted man after the war. The Allies resolved not to impose excessive retribution on Germany itself, but agreed to prosecute top government officials and SS members responsible for concentration camps for war crimes. Mengele was among them. He knew he had to evade capture. On the night of May 8th, hours after the war's official end, he re-entered Germany, attempting to conceal his SS affiliation and posing as a regular German soldier. This continued for weeks. In mid-June, he narrowly avoided capture when some 10,000 German soldiers, among whom he was present, were detained for questioning. However, days later, he was finally apprehended when his unit was arrested by an American division. Strikingly, when questioned, Mengele provided his real name, recorded as such by his interrogators. Yet inexplicably, his true identity, high-ranking SS member and Auschwitz's notorious Angel of Death, by then well documented, went unrecognized. In April 1945, he had been added to a list of wanted war criminals. This was Mengele's closest brush with justice. He was transferred between detention centers for weeks but was eventually released in September 1945. His release seems attributable to his lack of a blood group tattoo, standard for nearly all SS members. Mengele had refused this tattoo upon joining the SS in 1938, a decision now securing his freedom. He was dropped off at Ingolstadt in late September 1945, proceeding to Donauwörth. This was a time when Allied troops routinely stopped and questioned Germans in every town and village. Thus, he adopted the alias Fritz Ullmann, using documentation belonging to a friend of that name. He later slightly altered this to Fritz Holman. Another close call in Donauwörth prompted him to head for the Russian-occupied zone in eastern Germany. There, he finally contacted his wife Irene, assuring her of his safety and evasion of capture. Irene Mengele had already been repeatedly questioned about her husband's whereabouts. This marked the start of Mengele's years of constant movement across post-war Germany. His mental state during this period was unstable. Bizarrely, a couple with whom he briefly stayed in late 1945 recalled him stating his intention to surrender once he could receive a fair trial, asserting he had done everything possible to improve Auschwitz's conditions. Eventually, in early winter 1945, he found farm work in the Alpine foothills of southern Germany, using the Fritz Holman alias and working for the Fischers. The Fischers soon suspected their new lodger was a fugitive, particularly as Mengele referred to the Allies as the Crusaders, who had invaded Germany, and his bitterness about the post-war settlement often surfaced in conversation. Soon he re-established contact with his wife, who secretly visited him periodically in the following months. This was Mengele's life for several years, as the Allies sporadically attempted to locate him. These efforts were often half-hearted. Lacking any record of his location or sightings, many presumed Mengele had already died, as had numerous other senior Nazi war criminals who simply vanished after the war. Eventually, in 1949, Mengele resolved to leave Europe altogether. This was facilitated by the Rat Line, a network of Nazi sympathizers who employed various methods to smuggle former Nazis in hiding out of Germany. Aided by several individuals within this network, Mengele crossed the German-Italian border in mid-April 1949 and traveled to Genoa in northwestern Italy. There, he fraudulently obtained a Red Cross passport under the alias Helmut Gregor and, in summer, sailed for South America. The Argentine government was particularly welcoming to former Nazis, a consequence of strained relations between the Argentine regime and the United States. Several other Latin American states also viewed aiding German war criminals as defiance against U.S. neo-imperialism in Central and South America. Moreover, the Nazis had transferred substantial funds and material assets to Argentina prior to war's end, resources that afforded many relative freedom there after 1945. Consequently, figures like Adolf Eichmann, a key architect of the Holocaust, and Mengele were allowed to live unmolested in Argentina for many years. Mengele initially settled in Buenos Aires in late 1949. Mengele's subsequent years involved gradually establishing a new life in South America. He briefly worked as a traveling salesman, selling agricultural equipment, tools he had become familiar with on the Fischers' farm in southern Germany. After residing with a Nazi sympathizer, he moved into his own Buenos Aires apartment. Family funds channeled from Germany provided sufficient capital for him to acquire a stake in a carpentry business and soon rent a house. It is also probable that he practiced medicine illicitly during these years, lacking official licensure. Records suggest Mengele's involvement in organizing illegal abortions, for instance. His family life also evolved. Mengele's wife Irene, despite remaining loyal throughout the horrors of Auschwitz and the post-war period, declined to relocate to South America. They divorced in 1954 and Mengele remarried 4 years later to Martha Mengele, his widowed sister-in-law, previously married to his brother Karl, who had joined him in South America. Such was the laxity of Mengele's surveillance that he even briefly returned to Europe in the mid-1950s to visit his son and he resumed living in Argentina under his real name. Josef Mengele's ability to evade detection in plain sight during these years stemmed largely from the fact that no one actively sought him. German and Allied authorities presumed him dead by the late 1940s. This was despite his brief brush with Argentine authorities. In 1958, he and other doctors were questioned regarding an illegal abortion network, though Mengele was not charged. Having received a tip about Mengele's possible whereabouts, they prepared to apprehend him as well, but Mengele was in Bolivia at the time. Eichmann was taken to Israel and tried in a highly publicized prosecution of a Nazi war criminal, the most significant since the Nuremberg trials. He was convicted and executed in 1962, despite his close call in 1960, and despite Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal now knowing Mengele was alive in South America. He briefly returned to West Germany shortly thereafter. He then relocated to Brazil, residing on a farm near Sao Paulo owned by Nazi sympathizer Wolfgang Gerhard, while his second wife, Martha, settled in Italy for a time. These years marked the height of efforts to pursue Mengele, as Israeli agents and others sought his extradition from Latin America, attempting to pinpoint his location. As such, Mengele's precise whereabouts during this period often remain uncertain. Mossad gathered intelligence suggesting he was in Egypt at one point in 1962. The accuracy of this remains unverifiable, though South America remained Mengele's primary refuge. Aided by Nazi sympathizers like Gerhard and Hungarian expatriates Geza and Gittestammer. Their assistance extended to providing Mengele with further hideouts around Sao Paulo throughout the 1960s. Their aid even included Mengele assuming Gerhard's identity when Gerhard returned to Europe for family medical care. Josef Mengele evaded justice for the rest of his life. He died on February 7, 1979, after years of declining health. He had suffered a stroke in 1976 and other ailments, including hypertension. His death, attributed to drowning, occurred after a second stroke while swimming in the seaside town of Bertioga, Brazil. He was nearing his 70th year, making him one of the longest-lived notorious Nazi war criminals. 2 years prior, his son Rolf had visited him in Sao Paulo, their first meeting in over 20 years, and his first encounter with his father as an adult. Rolf's later recollections portray a man who, 30 years after the war, exhibited no remorse for his actions but rather reaffirmed that his Auschwitz conduct was part of his SS officer duties. Rolf Mengele concluded his father was an unrepentant Nazi. A final twist marked his flight from justice. For years, the world remained unaware of Mengele's death. Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal continued efforts to locate the Angel of Auschwitz, hoping for belated justice. It wasn't until 1985 when intelligence revealed a cache of Mengele's correspondence in his hometown of Günzburg, Germany, that his death years earlier was confirmed. A subsequent Brazilian investigation sought to identify his burial site, successfully locating his grave in Embu das Artes near Sao Paulo. Mengele was buried under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, the man who had sheltered him years earlier and whose identity he had adopted. Consequently, his body was exhumed in summer 1985. Examination confirmed the skeleton was highly likely Mengele's, a fact Rolf Mengele later corroborated. It was never reburied. Today, the skeleton of the man who once killed Auschwitz inmates simply to examine their organs serves as an educational aid at a Sao Paulo medical school. What can be said when evaluating a figure like Josef Mengele? As demonstrated, he was a heinous individual, seemingly devoid of empathy for those he experimented upon and murdered, whether in research or in his cold efforts to control disease outbreaks at Auschwitz. Perhaps assessing how he became the Angel of Death offers some insight. Mengele didn't join the Nazi Party until 1937. Until the mid-1930s, he was a promising medical student, combining anthropology exploration with human feature studies. By accounts of those who knew him, he was affable. Scholars note that his early work is generally unproblematic, lacking racism or violence, and could be interpreted as legitimate interwar scientific inquiry. In this respect, Mengele, prior to Nazi involvement, somewhat resembled Albert Speer, the architect who later became German war production minister. Before the Nazis' rise and their involvement, both were middle-class academics with promising careers, showing no outward signs of anti-Semitism or capacity for mass murder. Ultimately, however, after his Nazi Party involvement and his racial anthropology work under Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer in Frankfurt from early 1937, Mengele's character rapidly transformed. By late 1938, he was not only a Nazi Party member, but also of the Waffen-SS, the most fanatical Nazi paramilitary branch. In this capacity, he enthusiastically joined the war effort after the September 1939 Poland invasion. From the outset, some of his work involved the concept of supposed racial purity. He spent over 30 years in hiding across numerous locations and countries, even briefly returning to Europe and moving seemingly freely across Latin America. Strikingly, many individuals willingly aided a man guilty of Mengele's crimes, but he was also exceptionally fortunate. In 1945, Allied forces arrested and released him solely because he lacked the standard SS blood group tattoo. He then narrowly evaded arrest on several occasions in subsequent years and decades, notably in 1960 during Adolf Eichmann's Buenos Aires capture. As a result, Mengele escaped earthly punishment, but his crimes remain indelible. What are your thoughts on Josef Mengele? Was he perhaps the most brutal Nazi in his own way? What explains his rapid character transformation from 1937 onwards? Please share your comments below. In the meantime, thank you for watching.